Number 1. A friend of mine was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis and was so upset over it that she made a suicide attempt. She landed in the mental health wing of the local hospital, and I went to visit her one evening. I had a hell of a time finding the right place and felt like I'd walked through miles of increasingly decrepit hospital before I found the right wing. I went through a set of double doors and found myself staring down a dimly lit hallway with an incredibly creepy, weathered-looking old lady in a housecoat standing right in the middle of it. I walked down the hallway nervously, not taking my eyes off of the old woman. She didn't take her eyes off me either. I flinched as I walked by, but she didn't move. 10 feet beyond her was the doorway to the waiting room of the ward I was looking for. I breathed a sigh of relief as I reached the doors. Then, I glanced over my shoulder to see if the woman had moved. She was right behind me, staring into my face. I don't know how she managed to silently cover that 10 feet just as fast as I had moved. But she did. Number 2. There was this abandoned mental hospital in my town called Prudo Hospital, which was the sort of scary place that kids would go to show bravado. It was surrounded by woods, so obviously you would hear lots about it. You would hear lots of stories from people after it was abandoned, but the spookiest thing came from when it was still in service. My mother worked as an auxiliary nurse there for years, and she said that at night, the crippled kids who couldn't move due to severe diseases and birth defects would somehow get out of their cribs and get into the middle of the floor on the wards. Whoever or whatever was doing this would also go around and remove blankets from all of the patients and again pile them in the center of the room. Eventually, security was hired, believing it was someone getting into the hospital at night and doing all of these things to scare people or to just be trouble. However, even with security, they never found out who was doing these things at night. Number 3. I broke into an abandoned manufacturing plant in high school with a friend. The first floor was aisles with large shelves on either side, about 6-foot aisles, and you could only see between the aisles through slits in the shelves, so your view of everything was very limited. At the end of the aisles, there was a staircase that went up to a second floor. The floor was mostly rotted through, so moving around up there was dangerous, but we were small and 17 years old, so we checked it out anyway. We found a bunch of old rusted out tools and stuff like that, but nothing too interesting. We were up there probably 20 minutes when my buddy yelled over to me that he saw something move downstairs. We assumed we were busted, so we snuck back to the staircase. We didn't see anything moving around downstairs after a couple of minutes, so we went down. When we reached the bottom, we saw something, or someone, at the other end of the aisles to the northmost aisle, where the window we broke in from was. We moved towards the south end slowly, watching for movement. Eventually, we saw something move again on the stair side of the northmost aisle, and we bolted for it, got out, got in the car, and drove away. We haven't been back there since. Number 4. When I was a teenager, around 20 years ago, my friends and I trespassed on a condemned insane asylum called Eloise in southeastern Michigan. The worst thing wasn't that it was at night, with terrible flashlights, or the dirty patient records scattered all over the floor, the broken furniture, the torn up walls, the leaking water pipes, or the huge fungal bloom from the leaking water. The worst part was finding a tunnel and following it to a place inside, where power was still on. There was a light, an ominous-looking set of double doors, and an active security camera. We were all like, why was this here? What's going on? Later on, I found out that the asylum and a nearby hospital were connected. However, the Wikipedia page said that it closed in 1984, but we were all there several years after that. It was all very strange and bizarre. Number 5. I was the night watchman at an abandoned mental hospital turned state park for a summer in college. The only creepy thing that happened was one night I was with one of the state park police and we saw flashlights in one of the buildings. Kids constantly broke in and other people broke in to gut the old buildings for any copper they could find. So, as I was saying, one night we saw flashlights moving around, so we went in. The officer pulled her gun and flashlight, and in we went. We could hear footsteps on the floor above us, and we slowly and quietly went upstairs. We checked every single room, and found nothing. Then we heard footsteps above us again. This happened for a few floors, until we were on the very top floor, below the roof. We heard footsteps up on the roof, so we went up there. Still nothing. We never found anyone or any indication that anyone had been there recently. It was very creepy. Number 6. I wasn't able to sleep, so I figured I'd try for a nighttime job at this sleep clinic as a security guard. They offered the job and I accepted straight away, filled in a couple of forms, and that was that. It all seemed perfect. If I was going to be awake anyway, I might as well get paid for it. I got into the swing of things right away. It wasn't difficult. My duties consisted mainly of walking through the softly carpeted halls every hour or so, checking that the security doors were locked, and helping myself to as many free cups of coffee as I could. There were also 2 nurses on call, in case of a medical emergency, but they mostly slept through their shifts, so I barely saw them. My contact with the patients was limited. There seemed to be perhaps 15 or 20 of them, with some there for extended periods and others coming and going on an almost daily basis. I only ever saw them when they were asleep. It was strange seeing them like that, robbed of all context. They could have been bankers or beggars for all I knew. In the staff room, watching over the half-drunk remnants of other people's coffee and dog-eared magazines, was a bank of CCTV monitors wired up to the patients' rooms, so that the staff could keep an eye on them whenever they needed to. I spent most of my time there when I wasn't patrolling the corridors. It was oddly relaxing to watch all these strangers sleeping peacefully in their beds throughout the night, stirring gently every so often as they dreamed their unknown dreams. It gave me great comfort to watch them all lying there, dead to the world, with me as their silent custodian. Then there were the sleepwalkers. The clinic had a policy of leaving them to their own devices as much as possible, provided they weren't in any immediate danger, which they never were. The windows were bolted and made of toughened glass, and all external doors were kept securely locked. I used to come across them often in the halls and corridors, strange lost souls acting out their own private, intangible dream roles, murmuring to themselves while they performed odd and unintelligible actions. One night, I was walking down one of the usual corridors, the faint sounds of snoring echoing through the air, like waves rising and falling on a beach, when I came across one of the usual sleepwalkers. A middle-aged man, swollen and red-faced, wearing powder blue pyjamas and an incongruous pink dressing gown that flapped open as he walked. He seemed utterly oblivious to the world around him. As I approached, however, He stopped dead in his tracks and turned to face the wall, standing as motionless as a statue, with his face only millimeters away from the pastel-shaded brickwork. A dry, papery voice emanated from him as I passed. "You're going to do a terrible thing." I stopped and gazed bemused at the thinning hair on the back of his round head. "I'm sorry?" "You're going to do a terrible thing," he repeated, in the same 1,000-year-old voice. "Are you talking to me?" "There's no one else here." That was true, but usually the sleepwalkers were too wrapped up in their own nocturnal preoccupations to register other people, let alone speak directly to them. This was something of a novelty. My curiosity had piqued. "What do you mean?" "You're going to do a terrible, terrible thing. And there will be no one to blame but yourself." "Well, that's cheery. You should probably go back to bed." The man gave a little chuckle. It sounded phlegmy and unpleasant, like dark bubbles popping in tar. "What do you think you're doing here?" It was my turn to laugh. "I work here, looking after you guys." "You really think you can just walk into a job like that off the street, in a medical facility of all places?" There was no way he could have known about that. The back of his head was as implacable as ever. "It's not very plausible, is it? In fact, when you think about it, nothing about this place really adds up. You haven't really thought this through." I just stood there, staring, with the nameless muzak simpering on in the background. Perhaps I was hallucinating again. "I have to go," I mumbled, unsure of what else to do. My palms pricked with sweat. I walked on down the corridor, breathing in an inward sigh of relief. Strange. The sleepwalkers were usually placid and uncommunicative, locked in their own private little worlds. This man had been downright confrontational. I walked down to the staff room, my head a fog of speculation and confusion. I was surprised to see one of the nurses seated at the table, a fresh cup of mud-brown coffee steaming in front of her. She had her back to me. "The patients are lively tonight," I said. "You can't hide from things forever." It was the exact same voice echoing through the softly furnished room. "Sooner or later you'll have to face reality, and the longer you leave it, the worse it'll be." It felt as though an electric shock had jangled through my body. I ran round the table to face her, but when I did, I found that her eyes were closed, and she wore the sanguine expression of someone lost in a deep and dreamless sleep. Just then, the bank of TV screens on the wall behind me fizzed and crackled, lighting up the cramped little room with a brief flare like a flash of lightning from behind a dark cloud. I turned to face them and found only static bleeding into the room from each and every screen. But one by one, a picture flicked into life on each of the monitors, each showing a different scene in grainy black and white. It took me a moment to resolve the overexposed images into recognizable shapes and figures. On each screen, the camera gave a first-person perspective of someone moving jerkily through an unidentifiable scene. Sometimes a hallway or corridor, sometimes a busy city street. All at once, every screen exploded into action. A flurry of manic movement, lurching drunkenly this way and that. In this chaos of motion, I could see people wide-eyed and panic-stricken, their mouths open in silent scream, staring into the camera with horror in their eyes and fleeing in abject terror. Here and there, a hand could be seen on screen, the hand of the faceless protagonist. And on each screen, the unmistakable flash of a large knife cut through the hazy images. My stomach lurched as my eyes flicked from screen to screen, finding one scene of random carnage after another. The blade swung and stabbed and slashed, biting into flesh with sickening regularity. Black gouts of blood welled from every wound as the unknown assailant ploughed his way through victim after victim. Somehow, the grainy low-resolution images lent a further reality to these grim and brutal vignettes, and I felt each and every thrust of the knife with a visceral twist in my own guts. My eyes settled for a second on one particular screen, a confusing tumult of greys and blacks that resolved into a stark scene of bloody violence in a dingy vestibule as I fixed my attention on it. As I watched, the camera lurched past a battered door with a grimy stained glass window set to it. For an instant, a reflected blur of the protagonist was caught in that window, and the camera froze and then panned in on the image. It was a face. The reflection of a face. I looked to another monitor. A street scene, streaked with blood in the gutters and bodies strewn about the sidewalk. The chrome of a parked car threw an image back at the camera, which instantly halted and zoomed in on it. The same face, stark and washed out by the low-quality film. My eyes darted from one screen to another, and in each the same thing happened. The movement ceased, and the monitor filled with a single image taken from some small reflection in a puddle or a pane of glass. Soon, every one of the bank of monitors was displaying the same thing from a multitude of different angles. A single face, the features all but erased in a blurry white mass, but still, recognisably and irrecoverably, mine.